The aircraft is being pushed backward. Its actual speed across the ground, its real progress toward Santiago, can be 50 miles per hour slower than the airspeed indicator suggests, sometimes more. And in 1947, there was no instrument to detect it. No ground radar covering the Andes to verify position independently. No satellite. No GPS, no external reference point of any kind that could tell Captain Cook the difference between where his calculations said Stardust was and where Stardust actually was. Dead reckoning is a navigational method built on 3 pillars: heading, airspeed, time. If all 3 are accurate, the position calculation is accurate. If one is compromised, silently, invisibly, without registering on any instrument in the cockpit, the position calculation becomes fiction. Precise fiction. Professionally maintained fiction. Fiction that a crew of experienced aviators would have absolutely no reason to question, because everything they could see told them the calculation was correct. On the 2nd of August, 1947, Stardust was flying directly into an undetected jet stream headwind of enormous force, while Captain Cook's instruments reported normal progress toward Santiago. The aircraft was being pushed back, covering far less ground than its calculations suggested, still deep inside the Andes, still surrounded by terrain that rose to within feet of its altitude. When the radio operator transmitted that final position report at 17:45, Captain Cook believed, with complete and professional confidence, that they were 4 minutes from Santiago. He was not guessing. He was not estimating carelessly. He was reading the result of a calculation performed correctly, from data that the mountain and the invisible river of air above it had already made wrong. Stardust began its descent, following a flight plan constructed from a position that did not exist, descending toward an airport that was not where the instruments suggested it should be, and somewhere in that descent, through clear air, with 4 Merlin engines running perfectly, with a professional crew performing every procedure exactly as trained, the slopes of Mount Tupungato rose to meet them. The impact was not survivable. It was not gradual. It was total, immediate, and buried. The aircraft struck the mountain at speed, driving itself deep into the snowfield and glacial ice at high elevation, with a force that left nothing intact above the surface. And then the mountain did something that nobody had anticipated. Something that would keep it secret for longer than most of the searchers who looked for Stardust would remain alive to keep looking. The snow that buried the wreckage did not simply sit there. It compacted, it became ice. And the ice became part of the glacier, and the glacier began to move. Slowly, silently, indifferently, the way glaciers have always moved, carrying everything inside them, downward at the pace of decades. The search aircraft found nothing. The ground teams found nothing. The observers scanning the slopes with binoculars found nothing, because there was nothing to find above the surface. Stardust was not scattered across a visible ridge. It was not sitting in a valley waiting to be spotted from the air. It was inside the mountain, traveling with it, on a journey that would take 50 years to complete. And the 4 letters, STEND, that had occupied investigators and theorists and newspaper columnists for decades were not a mystery at all. They were not a coded message. They were not an interrupted distress call. They were not evidence of sabotage or conspiracy or anything darker than the ordinary operation of a professional crew doing their job. They were simply the final fragment of the word descend, transmitted calmly, professionally, completely, by a radio operator who had no idea that the descent he was reporting was the last thing Stardust would ever do. There is a law that operates beneath the surface of every disappearance, every hidden truth, every buried secret. It does not operate on human timelines, does not respond to grief or demand, or the desperate need of families who have spent decades without answers. It operates on its own schedule, quietly, indifferently, with the patience of something that has existed long before the questions were asked, and will continue existing long after the people who asked them are gone. The Andes understood this law perfectly. The glacier on the slopes of Mount Tupungato had been moving since long before the 2nd of August. It would continue moving long after 1998. But in 1998, it finally said something. Two Argentine mountaineers were working their way up the slopes of Mount Tupungato on an ordinary expedition. They were not investigators. They were not searchers. They were not representatives of any government or airline or family association still holding on to the hope of resolution. They were climbers. There for the mountain, not for the secret inside it. At approximately 15,000 feet, on the ice fields below the summit, they stopped. Pieces of metal were emerging from the glacier, partially visible, partially swallowed still by the ice that had carried them. Engine components, sections of undercarriage, fragments of airframe whose construction, whose riveting patterns and material composition spoke immediately of a specific era, a specific type of aircraft, a specific war, and then human remains, still clothed, preserved by the cold with the completeness that the investigators who arrived later described carefully and quietly in their reports. In the particular language that professionals use when the truth they are recording is also the truth that families have been waiting half a century to receive. Word reached the Argentine authorities. In the year 2000, a full investigation was mounted. Glaciologists, aviation analysts, forensic specialists. They traveled to Tupungato and confirmed what the physical evidence had already begun to suggest. The wreckage was stardust. Registration markings matched, engine components matched, structural fragments matched. The aircraft that had vanished from every radar, every search grid, every theory and investigation and newspaper column for 51 years had been inside the mountain the entire time, moving with it, patient as the ice itself. And then the cargo hold offered one final detail, so precise, so quietly extraordinary, that even the investigators who had seen everything paused at it. A packet of letters, still tied with string, addressed to destinations in Santiago. The mail that the radio operator had reported carrying in his final transmission was there, neat, organized, intact, as if the journey had simply paused, as if stardust had landed somewhere no one had thought to look. And the mail had been waiting patiently at the collection point for someone to come and deliver it. The investigation did not stop at identification. It went further, because a question remained that identification alone could not answer. How does an aircraft that should have cleared a mountain end up inside one? The answer, when it came, rewrote everything. The jet stream headwind that had pushed stardust backward through the upper atmosphere, that had silently, invisibly, catastrophically compromised every position calculation Captain Cook had made. It's not a freak occurrence. It was not an extraordinary alignment of meteorological misfortune. It was a feature of the Andes in winter. A known feature today, an unknown feature in 1947. The science had not yet caught up with the mountain, and 11 people had paid the price of that gap. The human remains were repatriated, with care, with dignity, with the full weight of official acknowledgement that had been owed to those families for more than half a century. They were given resting places, graves with names above them, something that death certificates issued in the absence of evidence had never been able to provide. The families who had spent 51 years with nowhere to go finally had somewhere. That is not a small thing. In the long and complicated accounting of what the glacier returned, that may have been the most important item of all, not the engine parts, not the registration markings, not the intact mail still addressed to people who had long since stopped waiting for it, but the simple human dignity of a name above a grave, of a place to stand, of a question finally answered. British South American Airways did not survive to see any of it. The airline that had named its aircraft after stars, that had flown routes others considered too difficult, that had bet its reputation on ambition exceeding its infrastructure, was absorbed into British Overseas Airways Corporation in 1949. 2 years after Stardust vanished, 1 year after Star Tiger, Stardust's sister aircraft disappeared over the Atlantic with 25 people aboard and was never found at all. The airline died quietly, its name surviving only in aviation history books, its lessons surviving in every flight operations manual that came after it, in every meteorological briefing that now includes jet stream data as standard, in every navigation system that cross-references airspeed against ground speed to ensure that what the instruments report and what is actually happening outside the aircraft are the same thing. The Glacier on Mount Tupangado is still moving, slowly, indifferently, on its own schedule, whatever remains above the point where Stardust struck in 1947, still traveling downward. At the pace of decades, the mountain has not finished speaking. It is simply taking its time. The way mountains always do. The way truth always does. Patient beyond any human measure of patience. Certain beyond any human capacity for doubt. Moving toward the surface, in its own time, whether anyone is ready to receive it or not. A clear afternoon, a professional crew, a routine flight, and then silence. No distress call, no wreckage, no answers. Just 4 letters tapped in Morse code, STEND, and then nothing. 11 people, 4 engines, 1 aircraft swallowed by the Andes. And the world searched and searched and found absolutely nothing. For 50 years. But the mountain was not finished. Welcome to WW2 Ghost Wings, where the skies of history still carry their secrets. Now, if you are someone who has seen enough of this world to know that the truth always surfaces eventually, do us a small favor, the way you would remind an old friend not to forget something important. Press that subscribe button. Don't let this channel pass you by. Some stories you only get one chance to hear. And before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? We read every single one. Now, let the story begin. The Second World War ended in 1945. But the machines it created did not simply disappear. They were too powerful, too expensive, too carefully engineered to be abandoned in a field and left to rust. Among all the aircraft that Britain produced during those 6 years of conflict, one stood above the rest. Not the fastest, not the most elegant, but the most trusted. The Avro Lancaster. It was a heavy bomber, built by a Manchester company called Avro, powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines that had powered the Spitfire in the skies over Britain. The Lancaster had a wingspan of over 100 feet, a bomb bay 33 feet long, and a reputation that crews carried with them the way soldiers carry a belief in something larger than themselves. Over 7,000 Lancasters were built. They flew deeper into enemy territory than almost any other bomber. They absorbed punishment that should have destroyed them and kept flying. Crews spoke about the Lancaster the way people speak about something they genuinely trust with their lives, because they did. But wars end. And when wars end, the question of what to do with the machines of war becomes urgent in a different way. Scrap them, store them, transform them. Avro chose transformation. Their engineers looked at the Lancaster and saw something beyond a bomber. They saw a long fuselage, a proven set of engines, a wing structure that had already demonstrated it could carry enormous weight across enormous distances. What they built from that vision came in 2 forms. The first was the Avro York, a new and wider fuselage grafted onto Lancaster wings and tail, more comfortable, more practical, more obviously suited to carrying passengers in something approaching dignity. The second was quieter, more minimal, more faithful to the original. They called it the Avro-Lancastrian, where the York was essentially a new aircraft dressed in Lancaster clothing. The Lancastrian was a Lancaster with its weapons removed. The gun turrets came out. The bombing nose was replaced with a smooth metal cone. The bomb aimer's position disappeared. The fuselage was cleaned and faired to reduce drag. But the four Merlin engines stayed exactly where they were. The wings were unchanged. The twin tail fins remained, stand a Lancaster and a Lancastrian side by side. And the family resemblance was not merely visible. It was almost everything. This created something unusual in post-war aviation, a compromise aircraft, a stopgap solution. Engineers and airline executives both used those words. And they were not wrong. The Lancastrian's cabin was narrow, just 64 inches wide at its usable interior. Between 9 and 13 passengers could be accommodated in an aircraft with 4 powerful engines and a wingspan of over 100 feet. By comparison, a Douglas DC-3 carried 21 passengers in considerably more comfort. But the Lancastrian could do something that DC-3 could not. It could travel 4,150 miles without stopping. And in a post-war world hungry for speed, that number changed everything. There is a particular kind of danger that does not look like danger at all. It looks like experience. It looks like a clear sky. It looks like a professional crew sitting at their stations, instruments reading normally, engines running smoothly, and a route they have flown before stretching out ahead of them like a familiar road. That is the most dangerous moment in aviation and in business and in life. The moment when everything looks exactly right is precisely the moment when the invisible threat moves closest. British South American Airways was not a cautious airline. It was an ambitious one. Founded in 1945 by a group of aviators who believed that South America represented the next great frontier for British commercial aviation. The airline flew routes that others considered too difficult, too distant, too demanding for the infrastructure available. They flew anyway. Their captains were not reckless men. They were experienced men. Men who had spent the war years accumulating flying hours over enemy territory, navigating in darkness, surviving conditions that commercial aviation had never been designed to handle. They brought that confidence with them into peacetime. And confidence, when it is earned through genuine experience, is a valuable thing, until the moment it becomes the reason a crew does not question what their instruments are telling them. Captain Cook was exactly that kind of man, steady, precise, experienced in the particular way that wartime aviators were experienced, which is to say, completely and professionally. On the 2nd of August, 1947, he sat at the controls of a Lancastrian registered GAG-WH, named Stardust, and prepared for what every record in his logbook told him was a manageable flight. Buenos Aires to Santiago, Chile, cross the Pampas, into the foothills, and then the Andes. The Andes, a mountain range roughly the size of Western Europe, with peaks reaching 23,000 feet, and a Lancastrian service ceiling of approximately 24,000 feet, 1,000 feet of margin. In the hands of a careful and experienced crew, that margin was considered acceptable. It had been flown before. It would be flown again. There was no particular reason, on that clear southern winter afternoon, to expect the 2nd of August to be different from any other crossing. Aboard Stardust that day were 11 people, 5 crew members, 6 passengers. Among the passengers, a Palestinian businessman whose cargo attracted speculation for decades afterward, a Swiss bank employee carrying documents of quietly significant value, a British diplomat traveling on government business. Ordinary people with ordinary destinations. Trusting in ordinary procedure, the aircraft climbed out of Buenos Aires and turned west. The Pampas, that vast, flat agricultural interior of Argentina, passed beneath them. Then the foothills rose. Then the Andes appeared ahead, their peaks pushing into the upper atmosphere, indifferent to the small metal aircraft climbing toward them with 4 Merlin engines pulling steadily against the altitude. Captain Cook flew on instruments. He knew his heading. He knew his airspeed. He knew how long he had been flying. From those 3 numbers, he calculated his position. This was dead reckoning. The standard navigational method of the era. Precise in principle, reliable under normal conditions. Trusted by every professional aviator crossing terrain without radar coverage. At 17:33 hours, the radio operator tapped out a message to Santiago Airport. 4 minutes out, preparing to begin descent. Clearance requested to proceed. Santiago acknowledged. Adherence granted. The crew of Stardust began configuring the aircraft for approach. Everything was normal. Everything was professional. Everything was exactly as it should be. And then, at 17:45 hours, one final Morse code transmission left the aircraft. A routine position report. Heading confirmed. Altitude confirmed. Estimated arrival confirmed. And at the very end of that transmission, 4 letters, tapped in perfect Morse code. S-T-E-N-D. And then, silence. Santiago called. Santiago called again. The 4-minute arrival window passed. Then 10 minutes. Then 30. The search began within the hour. But the Andes offered nothing. There is something deeply unsettling about a threat you cannot see. Not because it is violent, not because it is sudden, but because it allows you to feel completely safe, right up until the moment it destroys you. The crew of Stardust did not panic. They did not make errors. They did not cut corners or ignore procedures or act with anything less than the full professional precision their training had built into them over years of demanding service. They simply did not know, and not knowing in the wrong place, at the wrong altitude, above the wrong terrain, is enough. It has always been enough. The Andes in winter generate something that meteorologists today understand with considerable precision, but that in 1947 was still largely unmapped as a practical navigational hazard. The jet stream, a river of air moving at extraordinary speed through the upper atmosphere, invisible to the eye, undetectable by the instruments of the era, and capable of exerting forces on an aircraft that no cockpit gauge could measure or report. It does not create turbulence necessarily. It does not darken the sky. It does not announce itself through any sensation that a crew would recognize as warning. The horizon remains steady. The engines perform to specification. The control surfaces respond normally. The cockpit looks exactly as a cockpit should look during a routine high-altitude crossing. But beneath that perfect stillness,